I was lying in a hospital recovery room after spinal surgery when I called my son and whispered, "The doctor says I may never walk normally again. I need you here." For a few seconds, there was only silence. Then he laughed. "Dad, I'm running a company, not a nursing home." Before I could answer, I heard my daughter-in-law's voice in the background. "Tell him to hire somebody. We're not wasting our lives taking care of an old man." The call ended. I stared at the ceiling for a long moment. Then I made 3 phone calls that changed everything. Before we go any further, thank you for being here. It genuinely means the world to me. Drop a comment and tell me, where are you watching from? Your city, your country. I want to know who's in this room with me. A quick note. This story contains fictional elements crafted for entertainment and educational purposes. Any similarity to real names or places is entirely coincidental, but the message it carries is something I hope stays with you. The first thing I remember after surgery wasn't pain. It was the silence. Not the peaceful kind, the kind that tells you something is wrong before your brain catches up. I lay there in that recovery room at Houston Methodist, staring up at fluorescent lights that hummed like they had somewhere better to be. And the first thought that crossed my mind wasn't about my back or my legs or what Dr. Wells had told me before they put me under. It was simpler than that. It was nobody is here. 74 years old, founder of Callaway Construction and Development, a company worth more than most men dare to dream, and not one familiar face in that room. I reached for my phone with a hand that felt like it belonged to someone else, slow, clumsy fingers that had once signed contracts worth millions, now fumbling with a touch screen like a child. My hip ached from lying still so long. My lower back felt like someone had packed it with broken glass. But it was the phone screen that hurt worst of all. No missed calls, no texts, nothing from Derek. I stared at his name in my contacts for a moment longer than I should have. Then I pressed call. He picked up on the 4th ring. I could hear the background noise of his office phones ringing, someone laughing down a hall. The kind of busy sounds that tell you a person is in the middle of their real life. "Dad?" His voice was flat. Not cold exactly, just absent, like I'd interrupted something important. "Derek." My throat was dry from the anesthesia tube. I swallowed hard and tried again. "Son." "The surgery it went through, but Dr. Wells says the nerve damage is more serious than they thought. She says I'm going to need someone here with me for a while. Someone to help me get back on my feet." There was a pause. Not the kind where someone is thinking. The kind where someone already has their answer and is deciding how to deliver it. Then he laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh. It was short and sharp, the sound a man makes when he hears something he considers ridiculous. "You want me to come play nurse, Dad? Seriously?" His voice dropped into that particular tone he'd been using with me for the last few years, patient, patronizing, like he was explaining something obvious to someone slow. "I'm running a company. I can't just drop everything and fly to Houston every time you have a medical episode." My chest tightened. Not from the surgery, from something older and deeper. "Derek, I'm not asking you to. Hold on." I heard him shift the phone, the muffled sound of a hand covering the receiver. Then Vanessa's voice cut through clear enough that she clearly wanted me to hear every word. "Tell him he has a pension. Tell him to hire someone. We didn't build our lives to become caregivers, Derek." A pause. "Don't let him guilt you into this." The phone unmuffled. "You heard her, Dad." Derek's voice was quieter now, like he was embarrassed to be saying the words, but was going to say them anyway. "You've got money. Hire somebody. That's what it's for." I opened my mouth. I had things I wanted to say, 30 years of things, a lifetime of them. But what came out was barely a whisper. "I had surgery on my spine, Derek. I can't feel my legs properly. I thought maybe, Dad?" The word landed like a door closing. "I really can't do this right now." The line went dead. I held the phone against my chest, and looked back up at those humming lights. The machine beside me beeped its steady, indifferent rhythm. Somewhere down the hall, a cart rattled by. Life in that hospital continued exactly as it had before, completely unmoved by the fact that my son had just told me without quite saying the words that I was on my own. Dr. Patricia Wells had walked into my recovery room an hour before that call. She was direct, the kind of doctor who didn't soften things unnecessarily, which I'd always respected. She told me the surgery had gone as well as it could have under the circumstances, but the spinal compression had been more severe than the scans suggested. She told me there was a real possibility I would never walk the way I used to. She told me I would need intensive physical therapy, careful monitoring, and consistent support during recovery. What she didn't tell me was what to do when the person who was supposed to provide that support laughed at the idea. I lay there for a long time after the call, long enough to feel the full weight of what had just happened settle into my bones, long enough to let myself feel it, really feel it, before I decided what to do next. Because that's the thing about building something from nothing. You learn early that you can sit in the wreckage or you can start clearing it. Sitting never got me anywhere. I looked at the phone again. My hand had stopped shaking. I pressed the next number. 30 years ago, I built Callaway Construction out of a 2-room office in Midtown Houston with a second-hand drafting table, a telephone that cut out in the rain, and the stubborn belief that if you worked hard enough and planned carefully enough, the world would eventually stop laughing at you. It did. What people forget about men who build things is that the building never really stops. You don't put up a company and then walk away. You watch it every day. You learn its rhythms, its pressure points, its vulnerabilities. You study it the way a surgeon studies the body, not because you love the mechanics, but because understanding the system is the only way to protect it. That's why when Derek hung up on me, I didn't cry. I didn't stare at the ceiling wondering where everything had gone wrong. I made 3 phone calls. The first was to the hospital's private care coordination office. A woman answered on the second ring, professional, unhurried. "This is Art Callaway in post-op recovery room 417, I said. My voice was steadier now. "I need a private duty nurse assigned to me starting today. Full-time around the clock. I want your best available." "Of course, Mr. Callaway. I'll have someone reach out within the hour. Make it 30 minutes. A brief pause. "Understood." I ended the call. The second number I dialed was my corporate banking contact at First Capital of Texas, a man named Douglas Reed, who had managed Callaway Corporation's primary accounts for 11 years. He picked up on the first ring the way people do when they see a name they recognize. "Mr. Callaway, good morning. What can I—" "Douglas." I kept my voice even and clear. "I need you to freeze all corporate credit lines and company cards currently authorized under the name Derek Callaway, effective immediately." A short silence. "That's a significant action, sir. Can I ask—" "You can note in the file that I'm the primary account holder, and I'm exercising account control rights under our corporate banking agreement Section 7, which I believe you'll find gives me full authority to suspend secondary access without prior notice." I'd read that agreement 4 times over the years. You learn the documents that matter. "I don't require a reason to make this call, Douglas, but I am making it. Can you process that today?" "Yes, sir. I'll have it done within the hour." "Good." I set the phone face down on the hospital blanket for a moment. My back was burning. The painkillers they'd given me were starting to thin out at the edges, and every small movement sent a sharp reminder up my spine that my body had just been opened up and put back together. But my mind was working exactly as it always had. The third call was the one that mattered most. Robert Hale had been my attorney for 31 years. He'd helped me negotiate my first major contract, write my first real employment agreement structure, the early deals that turned a 2-room office into a regional powerhouse. He knew Callaway Corporation, the way a doctor knows a patient's chart, every detail, every decision, every clause we'd ever argued over at midnight before a deadline. He answered before the second ring. Art. His voice carried the weight of a man who'd been expecting bad news since he first heard I was going into surgery. Robert. I shifted against the pillow, wincing. I need you to activate the Emergency Executive Transition Clause in the Callaway Corporation Charter. Article 9, Section 3, you know the one. A beat of quiet. I could picture him at his desk, already reaching for the right file. The clause in question was something we'd built into the company structure years ago as a safeguard. It allowed me, as the founder and controlling shareholder, to remove any executive officer from their position immediately and without board vote, provided I held more than 51% of voting shares. I'd never had to use it, but I'd insisted it be there, and Robert had argued with me about it for 2 weeks before finally agreeing. Right now, I was glad I'd won that argument. You're removing Derek, Robert said. It wasn't a question. Effective today. I want the formal notice drafted and delivered to him and to the board by end of business. Another pause longer this time. Art, are you sure you just came out of... I'm sure. My voice didn't waver. 30 years ago, I built that company from nothing, Robert. I know exactly what I'm doing. I heard him exhale slowly, the way he did when he disagreed with something, but respected the decision. All right, he said finally. I'll have the documentation ready within 2 hours and send confirmation to your phone. But Art, there's going to be fallout. There already is, I said. That's why we're doing this. After I hung up, I placed the phone on the blanket beside me and looked up at the ceiling one more time. The room felt different than it had 20 minutes ago, not warmer, not easier, but cleaner somehow, like a window had been opened. Derek would find out about the credit cards first. Then the formal notice would hit. I could imagine the moment he read it, that particular kind of disbelief that comes when a person realizes the world doesn't actually owe them what they assumed it did. I wasn't angry. I want to be clear about that. What I felt in that moment wasn't anger. It was grief, quiet, settled, bone-deep grief for a version of my son that I'd been holding on to for years, even after the evidence told me to let go. But grief and action aren't opposites. Sometimes grief is exactly what sharpens your focus. The door to my recovery room opened. A woman in scrubs stepped in, late 30s, calm eyes, the kind of unhurried confidence that comes from years of doing difficult work well. She glanced at my chart, then looked directly at me. Mr. Callaway, I'm Grace Bennett. I was told you requested private duty nursing. I looked at her for a moment. There was something in the way she stood there. No performance, no over-warmth, just straightforward and present that caught my attention in a way I couldn't immediately explain. That's right, I said. Pull up a chair, Ms. Bennett. We're going to be here a while. Grace Bennett did not behave the way most people behave around money. That was the first thing I noticed about her in those early hours after she walked into my recovery room. I had spent 50 years watching people adjust themselves the moment they learned who I was, straightening their posture, softening their voice, finding sudden reasons to be agreeable. It was reflexive, unconscious, in most cases, the way a plant tilts toward light. You get used to it after a while. You stop expecting anything different. Grace didn't tilt. She pulled the chart from the foot of my bed, said it with her full attention. The way a mechanic reads a diagnostic report, not impressed, not dismissive, just focused, and then looked up at me like I was a patient and nothing more. Your blood pressure is higher than it should be for someone 3 hours post-op, she said. Have you been making phone calls? Despite everything, I almost smiled. A few. That would explain it. She set the chart down and began checking the IV line along my forearm, her movements precise and unhurried. You're going to need to rest your nervous system, Mr. Callaway, not just your spine. The two are connected. You can call me Art. She glanced up briefly. I'll stick with Mr. Callaway for now. That was Grace. No performance, no warmth manufactured to make me comfortable. No careful positioning of herself as someone I should like. Just directness delivered without apology. Over those first 3 days, I watched her work. She arrived each morning before 6 and didn't leave until her replacement, a quiet overnight nurse named Sandra, took over at 10. She helped me through the brutal early sessions of physical therapy, where my legs responded to commands with all the enthusiasm of a broken engine. She held her expression steady when I grunted through pain that made my eyes water. She didn't flinch, didn't offer hollow encouragements, didn't tell me I was doing great when I clearly was not. "That was terrible," she said after my first attempt to shift my weight from the bed to the chair beside it. My arms shook like wet paper. My lower body felt like it belonged to a stranger. "Thank you for the honesty," I managed between gritted teeth. "You'll do better tomorrow," she said. Then she helped me back into position with hands that were steady and sure. "You did worse yesterday, so the trend is moving in the right direction." I burst out laughing, a short, sharp sound that surprised even me. It was the first time I'd laughed since before the surgery, and it hurt my ribs, and it felt like something I'd needed without knowing it. On the second night, I woke up at 2 in the morning with pain radiating from my lower back, up through my shoulders. The kind of deep structural ache that makes a man feel his age in every cell. Grace was doing her documentation at the small desk near the window when I stirred, and she was at my side before I'd fully gotten my bearings. "Scale of 1 to 10, she said quietly, already reaching for the call panel to adjust my medication timing. 6, I said. Maybe 7. Honest answer or tough answer? My chest ached at that. 7.5. She adjusted the dosage, settled the pillow behind my lower back, and pulled the blanket straight. The small, practical kindnesses of someone who has learned that comfort lives in the details. "You don't have to pretend it doesn't hurt," she said. "Old habit." I stared at the ceiling. The room felt enormous at that hour, the way rooms do when you are alone with something heavy. My wife used to say I treated pain like an inconvenience to be managed rather than a signal to be heard. Grace sat back down at her desk, but she was still facing me. "She sounds like she knew you well, better than I deserved." My throat tightened around the words in a way I hadn't expected. "She passed 9 years ago, Margaret." "I'm sorry. She would have been here," I said. The words came out before I could stop them, raw and unpolished, the way things get in the middle of the night. She would have driven herself to this hospital and set up camp in that chair and driven every nurse on this floor half crazy with questions. That was Margaret. Grace's expression shifted, not with pity, which I couldn't have tolerated, but with something more careful. Recognition, maybe. "My father was sick for 2 years before he died," she said. Her voice was level, but I could hear the weight underneath it, the kind of weight that doesn't go away with time, only becomes more familiar. I was there every day I could manage. Some days I think about how different it might have looked if someone like him had access to proper support. I looked at her, then really looked at her. "Is that why you do this work?" She considered the question seriously, the way she considered everything. "Partly," she said. "And partly because people who are reduced to their worst moments deserve to be seen as more than that." Something in my chest cracked quietly at that. Not broke cracked. The way old wood does when heat finally reaches it after a long, cold season. I asked her carefully how she had ended up at Houston Methodist, specifically, out of all the hospitals in a city this size. It was a reasonable question. The kind you ask when you're getting to know someone. But something shifted in her face, barely a half-second thing, the way a person's expression changes when a question lands closer to home than expected. She answered smoothly enough. She'd trained here, built her network. Here knew the systems well. All true things I sensed, but not the whole truth. I didn't press. Not yet. On the third morning, a package arrived by courier. A thick envelope from the offices of Robert Hale, stamped with the firm's seal. The delivery nurse brought it in and set it on my tray table, and I could see it was the formal confirmation documents Robert had promised. I opened it slowly, my fingers still clumsy. The paperwork was all there. Derek's removal. The board notification. Clean, precise, irreversible. But tucked beneath the documents on a small piece of Robert's personal stationery was a note in his unmistakable, cramped handwriting. Just one line. "There's something else you need to know, Art. I'll come in person." I read it twice. Robert Hale had been my lawyer for 3 decades. He was not a man given to vague statements or unnecessary drama. If he was choosing to deliver something in person rather than by phone or document, it was because whatever it was didn't belong in writing. I set the note down on the blanket. My pulse ticked upward, not from fear exactly, from the particular alertness of a man who has learned to recognize the feeling of the ground shifting beneath him before the tremor is visible. Grace came in a moment later to check my vitals. She glanced at the documents on the tray, then at my face. "Good news or complicated news?" she asked. I folded Robert's note and slipped it beneath my hand. "The kind that comes in person," I said. She raised an eyebrow but didn't ask further. She wrapped the blood pressure cuff around my arm and pressed the button, and we both watched the numbers climb. "Still too high," she said. "I know," I told her. "It's going to get worse before it gets better." Robert Hale was 71 years old and had the posture of a man who had spent his career standing firm in rooms that were trying to push him out. He walked into my hospital room on the morning of October 18th, with his leather briefcase under one arm, and that expression I'd learned to read over 30 years of working together. The one that meant he had facts. Those facts were unpleasant, and he was going to deliver them anyway, because that was the job. He shook my hand first. Firm the way he always did, like the ritual mattered regardless of circumstances. Then he set the briefcase on the chair beside my bed, looked me over with the appraising eye of someone who has watched a person weather hard things before, and said, "You look better than I expected." "Low bar," I said. "Lowest." He pulled the chair close and sat down, and the fact that he didn't open the briefcase immediately told me he wanted to say something before the documents came out. "How's the pain?" "Manageable. Talk to me, Robert." He nodded once, accepting the redirect. He folded his hands on his knee, a habit he had when organizing his thoughts, and began. "Derek retained outside counsel the morning after the removal notice was delivered," he said. "A firm out of Greenway Plaza. They filed a preliminary challenge within 24 hours, which was fast. Aggressive." He paused. "They dropped it within 6 hours of filing." I watched his face. "Why?" "Because his own attorneys told him the truth." Robert leaned forward slightly. "Art, when Derek walked into that meeting with his lawyers and told them he was the CEO of Callaway Corporation and he intended to contest his removal, do you know what the first thing they did was? They pulled the corporate charter." "They pulled the corporate charter," he confirmed. "And then they had a very uncomfortable conversation with their client about the difference between having a title and having power." He opened the briefcase then and removed a single folder, setting it on my tray table. "You want to walk me through it, or you want me to?" "You," I said. "I want to hear how it sounds out loud." Robert opened the folder. "When you brought Derek on as CEO 8 years ago, we structured Callaway Corporation with a dual-class share system. You retained Class A shares, voting shares, 100% of them. Derek was issued Class B shares, which carry economic rights, meaning he participates in profits, but zero voting control. He cannot make binding corporate decisions, cannot override board appointments, and has no legal standing to contest executive removals made by the Class A shareholder." He looked up at me. "Which is you?" "Which is me." His attorneys explained this to him. Something moved behind Robert's eyes, not quite satisfaction, not quite sympathy. By all accounts, he did not take it well. I let that sit for a moment. The morning light was coming through the window at a low angle, casting long shadows across the floor of my room. I thought about Derek 8 years ago, the day I'd handed him the CEO title, the way his face had looked. Proud. Certain. Like he'd been handed something he'd earned rather than something I'd chosen to give. "He never read the charter," I said. "Not carefully enough to understand what he'd agreed to." Robert closed the folder. "Art, I need to ask you something directly." "Go ahead." How much do you know about what's been happening inside the company over the last year? My chest tightened, but I kept my expression steady. Tell me what you know. Robert reached back into the briefcase and produced a second folder, this one thicker with a small yellow sticky note on the front that read, VH Confidential. He set it on top of the first. Vincent Hale contacted me 2 nights ago, he said. Vincent Hale had been Callaway Corporation's chief financial officer for 20 years, a quiet, meticulous man from Beaumont, Texas, who had joined the company when it was still small enough that everyone knew everyone's name. He was not a man who made unnecessary calls. He said he'd been sitting on something for 6 months because he wasn't certain enough to act. When he heard about the removal, he decided certain enough had arrived. Robert opened the second folder and turned it so I could see the first page. It was a series of printed emails, each one highlighted in yellow at specific passages. My eyes moved down the first email, then the second. The sender address on every one of them was not Derek's corporate account. It was a personal address I didn't recognize, but the name attached to it made the back of my neck go cold. Vanessa, every strategic communication related to accessing your personal accounts, every contact with outside financial advisors, every preliminary inquiry to the bank about power of attorney arrangements, they all originated from Vanessa's personal laptop, Robert said. His voice was careful and deliberate, the voice of a man making sure each word lands clearly. Derek signed what she put in front of him. But the architecture of this, the planning, the sequencing, the legal framing, that was her. My jaw tightened. I could feel my pulse in my temples. How long? Based on the earliest email Vincent found, she began laying groundwork approximately 2 years ago. 2 years. While I was sitting at company dinners with them. While I was signing birthday cards for their house, attending Tyler's baseball games, doing all the ordinary things that families do when they are pretending to still be a family. She's been building a case to have me declared mentally incapacitated, I said. It wasn't a question. The emails had already told me. That appears to have been the endgame, yes? Robert's voice tightened slightly. If she could establish a pattern of cognitive decline documented, attested to by people around you, she could pursue a guardianship filing through the probate court. Under Texas law, that would give the appointed guardian, almost certainly Derek, control over your financial and legal affairs. He paused to let that land. Including Callaway Corporation's assets. I looked out the window. On the street below, Houston was doing what Houston always did, moving, building, hauling, transacting, completely indifferent to the small, private devastations happening at altitude. Vincent, I said, is he trustworthy? He drove to my office at 9 at night with a flash drive and his resignation letter in the same envelope, Robert said. He told me he'd rather walk away clean than be part of whatever this was becoming. Robert's voice shifted, and something in it made me look back at him. He tore up the resignation letter when I told him you'd need him. My throat felt thick. Good man. He is. Robert squared the folders on the tray table. Art, there's more. I want to tell you everything I know today while we're in the same room. But I also need you to understand that what we're dealing with is not just a family dispute. This has dimensions that are going to require careful management. He looked at me steadily. Are you ready for that? I held his gaze. My back ached. My legs still felt distant and unreliable beneath the blanket. The machine beside me beeped its patient rhythm. Robert, I said, I have rebuilt this company from nothing more than my own stubbornness more than once. Whatever Vanessa thinks she built against me, she built it against someone who has survived worse. I reached out and tapped the folder on the tray. Show me everything. Robert reached into the briefcase one final time. Before he could produce whatever came next, his phone buzzed on the side table. He glanced at the screen. A ripple crossed his face, brief, controlled, but there, and he stood up. I need to take this in the hall, he said. 1 minute. He stepped out. The door hadn't fully closed when I heard his voice drop to something low and urgent on the other side of it. I looked at the folders on my tray. I looked at the door. Grace came in to check my IV line and caught my expression. "Whatever just happened," she said, reading my face with that unsettling accuracy of hers. "It wasn't good news." "No," I said. My hands were very still on the blanket. "I don't think it was." Margaret used to say that secrets inside a family are like termites inside a wall, quiet, invisible. And by the time you see the damage, the foundation is already gone. I thought about that line a lot on the afternoon of October 19th, sitting in my hospital bed, watching the Texas sky outside my window turn from pale blue to the deep burnt orange it gets before the sun drops behind the city. Robert had texted that morning to say he was coming back. He hadn't said why. He hadn't needed to. He walked in at 4:15, set his briefcase down, and before he even sat, I said, "Whatever you found, just say it." Robert pulled the chair close, laced his fingers together, and looked at me with the expression of a man who has practiced a difficult conversation on the drive over and still hasn't found a comfortable way to begin it. "The phone call I took yesterday," he said. "That was Vincent Hale. He'd been going through internal financial records, the kind that don't get flagged in routine audits, because they're structured to look like standard operational disbursements." He opened his briefcase and placed a single printed summary sheet on my tray. "Art, 10 years ago when you liquidated part of your personal investment portfolio, do you remember telling me it was a rebalancing move?" My chest went very still. "I remember. That wasn't a rebalancing move." I let out a slow breath through my nose. "No, it wasn't." Robert leaned forward. $4 million. Paid through a financial intermediary company you set up specifically for that transaction, which then dissolved 18 months later. Clean, untraceable to Derek directly. He paused. "I helped you structure that. I knew what it was for. But what I didn't know until last night was that it didn't stop there." The room felt smaller suddenly. The machine beside me beeped, indifferent as ever. "How much more?" I asked. My voice came out steadier than I felt. "Vincent's numbers put it at an additional 1.2 million over the following 4 years. Smaller amounts, different channels, all filtered through companies that no longer exist." Robert met my eyes. "Derek has been insolvent in practical terms for most of his adult life. The lifestyle, the house in West University, the cars, none of it was built on what he earned. It was built on what you quietly made disappear." The tightness in my chest spread up into my throat. I gripped the blanket with one hand, feeling the fabric bunch under my fingers, needing something solid to hold on to. "He never said thank you," I said. The words came out low, almost involuntary. Not once, not a single time. Robert's expression shifted, something raw and honest moved across his face, there and gone. "I know Art." I told myself it was because he didn't know. My eyes were burning now, stinging in a way I hadn't expected, and I pressed my lips together hard. I structured it so he wouldn't know, so he wouldn't have to feel like he'd failed. I thought I was protecting him. "You were," Robert said quietly. "I was protecting myself," I said, and the truth of it hit me in the sternum like a physical blow. I didn't want to see what he'd become. So I made the problem go away and told myself it was love. Grace was near the window adjusting the blinds against the low afternoon sun. I heard her go very still at that, her hands stopping on the cord, but she didn't turn around. She was giving me the only privacy the room allowed. "What happened to the money?" I asked. "The 4 million. What did he spend it on?" "Sports betting primarily. Some high-risk private investment groups that promised returns they couldn't deliver. The kind of outfits that operate just inside the legal edge." Robert paused. "He has a pattern, Art. Not a phase. A pattern." I turned my face toward the window. The sky was nearly dark now, the last orange edge of it fading fast. Margaret had loved Houston sunsets. She used to drag me out to the back porch in the evenings, insisting I stop working long enough to watch the sky do something beautiful. I could picture her standing there, her hand on my arm, saying, "Art, would you just look at that?" I missed her so badly in that moment. It felt like a physical wound opening up somewhere behind my ribs. She knew, I said. Margaret. She knew something was wrong with him even when I wouldn't see it. She was a perceptive woman, she told me once. My voice cracked slightly, and I had to stop and swallow before continuing. She told me that giving a person everything they want is one of the cruelest things you can do to them. I thought she was being harsh. I laughed short and broken. She was right. She was right about everything. Robert gave me a moment. I was grateful for it. Then Grace turned from the window and walked to the side of my bed. She didn't touch my hand. She wasn't that kind of person, and I wasn't that kind of man. But she stood close enough that I could feel her presence steady and real, and she looked at me with those calm, direct eyes of hers. "What do you need right now, Mr. Calloway?" she asked. "Not what do you want to do, not how are you feeling. What do you need?" I took a long breath and straightened my back against the pillow, feeling the familiar burn of the surgical site pulling tight. "I need to know if there's more," I said, looking back at Robert. "Is there anything else Vincent found that I don't know yet?" Robert hesitated, and in 31 years Robert Hale had almost never hesitated. "There is," he said. "But I want Vincent to walk you through it himself. Some things are better heard from the person who found them." He closed his briefcase. "I'd like to bring him tomorrow morning, early." My jaw tightened. My hands were still on the blanket, steady now where they had gripped hard before. "Fine," I said. "Early. And Robert, whatever it is, don't soften it." He picked up his briefcase and stood, and the look he gave me on the way out was the look of a man who had known me long enough to understand that the warning wasn't necessary, but appreciated it anyway. After he left, I looked at Grace. "My father used to say," she said carefully, "that the most expensive thing a man can own is a secret he keeps to protect someone else." I stared at her for the long moment. Then I said, "Your father sounds like he knew something about that firsthand." Something flickered across her face, quick and complicated there, and gone before I could name it. She straightened the blanket at the foot of the bed. "Get some sleep, Mr. Calloway," she said. "Tomorrow's going to be a long day." Vincent Hale arrived at 7:15 the next morning, before the breakfast trays came around, and before the day shift had fully settled into its rhythm. I heard him before I saw him. The particular sound of a man walking with purpose through a hospital corridor, measured and unhurried, but with no wasted motion. He appeared in the doorway, in a charcoal blazer, with no tie, his salt and pepper hair combed back neatly, and he looked like a man who had slept about as well as I had, which was to say, not much at all. "Mr. Calloway." He crossed the room and shook my hand firm, direct the handshake of someone who respects your time. "I'm glad you're well enough to have this conversation." "Sit down, Vincent," I said, "and talk to me like the CFO. You are not like someone visiting a sick man." Something shifted in his posture, a small release of tension, like I'd given him permission to drop a performance he'd been holding. He sat in the chair across from me, placed a tablet flat on the tray table, and folded his hands over it. Robert stood near the window. Grace was at the far end of the room checking medication. Neither of them was going anywhere. "I need to show you something," Vincent said. "And I need to preface it by saying that what I'm about to show you came to me through an informal channel. A contact of mine in hospital security. We go back 15 years. We were in the same church congregation in Beaumont before I moved to Houston. He passed this along because he didn't know what else to do with it." Vincent held my gaze steadily. "This footage has not been submitted to anyone officially. It is not a legal document. But you have a right to see it." "Show me," I said. He turned the tablet to face me and pressed play. The video was grainy the way hospital corridor footage always is, washed out by fluorescent light, timestamps burned into the bottom right corner in white digits. The hallway shown was the 3rd floor of Houston Methodist, the same floor my recovery room sat on. The date read October 16th. The time read 2:17 in the morning. A figure appeared at the far end of the hallway. Male, medium build, wearing a dark jacket with the collar turned up. He walked toward the camera slowly, hands in his pockets, and stopped outside the window that looked into the recovery suite where I had been lying that night. My recovery suite. I recognized Derek before he'd taken 3 steps. The way he carried his shoulders slightly forward, the particular rhythm of his walk, I had watched that walk since he was 7 years old. He stood at that window and looked in. I watched the timestamp in the corner of the screen. 2:17, 2:18, 2:19. He didn't move. He stood with his hands still in his pockets, and he looked through that window at whatever he could see of me in that bed. And he did not knock, did not call a nurse, did not press the emergency assistance panel that was clearly visible on the wall 2 feet from where he stood. 2:20, 2:21. My throat was closing. I could feel the tightness crawling up from my chest into my jaw, and I pressed my back teeth together hard. 2:24, 2:25. He checked his watch. He looked back through the window. Then he turned and walked back the way he had come, disappearing off the edge of the frame. 4 minutes after that, according to the incident report, Robert had obtained the night nurse on her regular rounds, found me on the floor of my recovery room. I had tried to shift myself to the edge of the bed without calling for help. My legs hadn't responded, and I had gone down hard against the side rail. I didn't remember any of it clearly. I remembered pain, then voices, then light. 14 minutes. Derek had stood at that window for 14 minutes. Vincent reached across and stopped the playback. He sat back in his chair and looked at me with the careful expression of a man who understands that some information cannot be unseen. I was gripping the side rail of my hospital bed so hard, my knuckles had gone white. My eyes were burning, not quite tears, but close enough that I had to blink hard twice and look at the ceiling for a moment. "He was there," I said. My voice came out rough, scraped, raw. "He was right there." "Yes, sir," Vincent said. His voice was quiet. "He was. He watched." The word came out like something broken. He stood there, and he watched, and then he walked away. Robert made a sound near the window, low, almost inaudible, the sound a man makes when something has confirmed a fear he'd been carrying. "There is no law that compelled him to intervene," Robert said carefully. "He wasn't your designated caregiver. He had no legal obligation, technically speaking. But as evidence of intent and character, I don't need a legal analysis right now, Robert." My voice came out sharper than I intended, and I stopped, pressed my hand flat against the blanket, forced myself to breathe. "I'm sorry. Give me a minute." Grace had crossed the room without me noticing. She wasn't touching me, she understood. I wasn't the kind of man who wanted to be handled in hard moments. But she was standing near enough that when I turned my head, she was there. "I kept calling him," I said to her, to no one to the room. After the surgery, when I didn't know what was happening with my legs, I kept looking at the door, thinking he might still come. My voice cracked on the last word, and I stopped again, hating the sound of it. I told myself he was just busy, that he didn't understand how serious it was. "He understood," Grace said. Not cruelly, just plainly, the way she said everything. The grief that had been sitting in my chest since October 14th shifted into something harder and colder and more settled. Not anger exactly, something beyond anger. The kind of clarity that comes when you finally stop hoping you were wrong. "Save the file," I said to Vincent. "Every copy, every backup stored somewhere he can't reach." "Already done," Vincent said. 3 separate locations. I looked at him, then really looked at him. 20 years this man had worked for my company. 20 years of quarterly reports and late nights and decisions made under pressure, and he had driven to Robert's office with a flash drive and a resignation letter because he couldn't carry the weight of this alone anymore. "Vincent," I said, "you could have stayed out of this, kept your head down and let it play out." He met my eyes without flinching. "With respect, Mr. Calloway," he said, "I've worked for Calloway Corporation for 20 years because it was built on something real. I wasn't going to watch it get hollowed out without saying something." My throat was tight again. I nodded once. After this is over, I said, we're going to talk about what your next 20 years look like. A corner of Vincent's mouth moved, barely a smile, more like the shadow of one. I'd appreciate that, sir. After they left, I lay in the quiet of the room watching the ceiling. Grace came to check my vitals without being asked the way she always did when she sensed the numbers had shifted. She wrapped the cuff around my arm, looked at the reading, and said nothing about the result. Instead, she asked very quietly, "How long has he worked for you?" 8 years as CEO, I said. He's been around the company since before that. And in 8 years, she said, pressing the cuff release. Did you ever really look at who he was becoming? The question landed somewhere deep and quiet. I looked at my hands on the blanket. No, I said. I kept looking at who I remembered him being. She noted something on her clipboard and moved toward the door. Then she stopped, hand on the frame, and said without turning around, "Sometimes the hardest thing isn't finding out the truth. It's admitting how long you already knew it." She walked out. I stared at the door long after she was gone. There are conversations that begin as small talk and end as confessions. I hadn't planned to ask Grace anything significant that night. It was October 23rd, 9 days since the surgery, and the hospital had settled into its late evening quiet, the kind that makes a room feel larger than it is, makes a man more honest than he might be in daylight. I was propped up against the pillows, watching her move through her end-of-shift routine, and I found myself studying her the way you study something you've been meaning to understand. "Grace," I said. She looked up from the medication log. "Mr. Calloway, you never finished answering my question about why you chose this hospital." She set the clipboard down on the desk. Her hands were steady, they always were, but something in the set of her shoulders shifted just slightly, the way a person shifts when they decide to stop performing composure and just have it. "No," she said. "I didn't. I'm asking now." She pulled the chair to the side of my bed and sat down, which she didn't always do. The fact that she sat told me she'd already decided to answer. "My father's name was Thomas Bennett," she said. "Does that mean anything to you?" The name hit me somewhere low in the chest, soft and sudden, like a stone dropping into still water. I held very still. "Thomas Bennett," I repeated. "He was an architect and a builder," Grace said. Her voice was even carefully even, the way voices get when the person speaking has rehearsed the words enough times that the emotion has been worn smooth. In the early 1980s, he went into business with a man he trusted. They built something together from the ground up, literally with their own hands. And then, when the company started to become something real, his partner found a way to buy him out without technically breaking any laws. She looked at me directly. "You know how that works, I'm sure." My throat went dry. "Share dilution," I said. "A new investment round," she confirmed. "Priced high enough that my father couldn't participate. His percentage dropped from 30% to less than 4% within 18 months. Then came the buyout offer, lowball, take it or leave it. He took it because he had a family and no leverage, and the alternative was a legal fight he couldn't afford." She paused. "He spent the rest of his life working for other people's companies. He died in 2019. A small house in Pasadena, Texas. Nothing left." The weight of that pressed down on my chest until I could feel it in my breathing. "Grace!" My voice came out rough. "The partner that was me." "Yes," she said, simply. No venom in it, which somehow hurt more than venom would have. "Then why?" I started again. My eyes were stinging badly now, and I blinked hard, furious at myself for it. "Why are you here? Why did you take this job? Why are you sitting in that chair right now instead of what?" she said. "Hating you. You'd have every right." Grace looked down at her hands for a moment, then back up at me. "My father didn't raise me on hatred, Mr. Calloway. He was bitter for a while, I won't lie to you, and say he wasn't. But by the end, what he talked about most wasn't what he lost. It was what he built in those first years before everything went wrong. Her voice wavered just once like a candle in a draft, and then steadied. He used to say that the work itself was the thing that mattered, that nobody could take the work away from him. I pressed my hand flat against the blanket, hard, trying to hold something together that felt like it was pulling apart. I took everything else, I said. You did, she agreed. She didn't soften it. I respected her for that. Then why? I asked again, and this time my voice cracked on the word, and I didn't try to hide it. Why come here, Grace? Why take care of me? She was quiet for a beat, not the avoidant kind of quiet, but the kind where someone is choosing words that are actually true. Because I needed to see if you were the man my father described from the early years, she said, or only the man from the end of the story. She met my eyes steadily. And because I believe that people can be more than their worst decisions, I needed to believe that. For my own sake, as much as anything. I turned my face toward the window. Houston glittered out there in the October dark, indifferent and beautiful, and my eyes were burning so badly I could barely see it. 30 years. I had spent 30 years not thinking about Thomas Bennett, because thinking about him required acknowledging what I had done, and I was very good at not acknowledging things that complicated the story I told myself about who I was. He was a good builder, I said. My voice had dropped to almost nothing. Better instincts than me early on. I was afraid of that. I know, Grace said quietly. He said the same thing about you in his journal, not as an accusation, just as a fact. My head snapped toward her. He kept a journal. Something moved across her face, careful, deliberate. He kept a journal, she said, and there are things in it about you that I think you should read. Not tonight, but soon. She stood smoothing her scrubs, composing herself back into the professional she was. When you're ready. I watched her move to the door, my heart hammering in a way that had nothing to do with my spine. Grace. She stopped. I'm sorry for what I did to your father. I know that's 30 years too late, and I know it doesn't fix anything. But I am. She stood in the doorway with her back to me, and her shoulders rose and fell with one long breath. Tell me that again when you're out of this hospital, she said, and mean it the same way. Then she walked out, and I lay in the dark with the particular weight of a man who has just seen himself clearly for the first time in a very long while. A man who has kept a secret for 3 years carries it differently than a man who has kept it for 3 days. Robert Hale walked into my hospital room on the morning of October 25th, with his briefcase under his arm, the same as he always did. But his posture was different. There was something compressed about him, the way a person holds themselves when they've made a decision they can't take back and are walking toward the consequences of it. I knew before he opened his mouth that whatever he was about to tell me was going to cost both of us something. He closed the door behind him. Didn't open the briefcase. Just sat down in the chair across from me and put his hands on his knees and looked at me the way a man looks at someone he has wronged. Art, he said, I need to tell you something before we go any further. And I need you to let me finish before you say anything. My chest tightened. Go ahead. He took a breath that was slower than his usual measured pace. 3 years ago, I was approached through an intermediary, a consultant I'd worked with on a commercial real estate transaction, someone I had no reason to distrust at the time. The approach was indirect, careful, structured in a way that gave everyone involved plausible distance. His jaw tightened. The offer was $200,000 to make a single change to the interim estate document you signed after Margaret died. The air in the room felt different suddenly, thicker. What change? I said. My voice came out flat, stripped of everything. Your original document required a panel of 3 independent parties to petition for conservatorship if you were ever deemed unable to manage your own affairs, Robert said. He held my gaze without flinching, which I understood was costing him. The revision changed that to allow a single qualified family representative to initiate the process. He paused. 1 person, not 3. which meant that Derek, with Vanessa directing him, could theoretically have moved to have you declared legally incapacitated with far less resistance than your original document allowed. My hands were gripping the side rail of the bed. I could feel the metal digging into my palms, and I didn't loosen my grip. "You took the money," I said. "I took the money." He said it straight, no hedge, no softening. And I have spent 3 years not sleeping properly because of it. I stared at him. Robert Hale. 31 years. The man who had argued with me for 2 weeks about Article 9, Section 3, until I threatened to find another lawyer. The man who had been at Margaret's funeral standing 3 rows back so he wouldn't intrude on family. The man whose name I had said to every person who asked me who I trusted. Why? The word came out harder than I intended, scraped and raw. Robert's face tightened with something that looked almost like physical pain. "Because I was in debt," he said. "Personal debt, not professional, a real estate investment that collapsed badly in 2020. I had a second mortgage I was about to default on, and a daughter finishing medical school, and I told myself it was one small clause, one small change, something that might never even matter." His voice broke slightly on the last sentence, and he stopped, pressed his mouth together, composed himself. "I told myself a lot of things. But you came back," I said slowly. "You're here right now. I reversed the clause 6 months ago," he said, "before your surgery was even scheduled. I paid out of my own pocket to have the document properly amended through proper channels, no trace back to you, no legal exposure for you. The original 3-party requirement is restored." He reached into his briefcase and placed a certified copy on my tray. "I can't undo what I did, but I could undo what it made possible." I looked at the document. Then I looked at Robert. His eyes were glassy, not quite tears, but the absolute edge of them, the place a proud man stands when he refuses to cross into crying, but cannot pretend he is fine. "You should know," he said, his voice rough now, "that if you choose to report this to the state bar, I will not contest it. What I did was a violation of my professional obligations and my personal ones. I have no defense that matters." The room was very quiet. Grace was near the window. I was aware of her presence the way you're aware of a steady light in a dark room without looking directly at it. I sat with it. All of it. The $200,000, the sleepless years, the clause he'd reversed alone before I ever knew it existed. Robert. My voice came out tired, bone-tired, the kind of tired that has nothing to do with the body. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" "Because I was ashamed." He said it without decoration. "And because I kept hoping it would never become relevant. That Derek would find a way to be the man you hoped he was." He looked down at his hands. "I was wrong about that." I exhaled slowly. "You were wrong about a lot of things." "Yes, so was I." I held his gaze until he looked up at me. "You reversed the clause. You came back. You've been building this case with me for the last 2 weeks, knowing this was sitting between us." My hands loosened on the rail. "I need you, Robert. I need the best attorney I know, and that's still you, even with all of this." I let that land for a moment. "But we are going to talk about this again when it's over. Fully." Robert's breath came out in one long, shaking exhale. His hands on his knees were trembling very slightly, the hands of a 71-year-old man who had been carrying $200,000 of shame for 3 years and had just put it down. "Understood," he said. "Thank you, Art. Don't thank me yet." I picked up the certified document from the tray. "Now sit down and tell me everything else, because Dr. Wells is coming in 20 minutes, and there's something about those vitamins Vanessa brought that I think we need to talk about right now." Robert stiffened. "What vitamins?" Before I could answer, the door opened, and Dr. Patricia Wells stepped in, her expression carrying the particular gravity of a physician who has results she didn't expect and doesn't know yet how the patient will receive them. "Mr. Calloway," she said, looking between me and Robert, "I'm glad you have your attorney present. You're both going to want to hear this. I had faced a lot of difficult moments in 74 years. I had buried my wife. I had watched a company I built with my own hands come close to collapsing twice. I had sat in rooms with men who wanted to take everything I had and smiled at them while they tried. But nothing, not one moment in my entire life had prepared me for what Dr. Patricia Wells said next. She stepped fully into the room, closed the door behind her, and placed a small, sealed evidence bag on my tray table. Inside it was the amber prescription bottle Vanessa had brought us during her visit 4 days earlier. She had set it beside my water glass with a warm smile and said they were high-quality senior vitamins, the kind with extra B12 and magnesium. She had even opened the bottle and shaken 2 capsules into my palm herself. I sent these to the lab 3 days ago, Dr. Wells said. Her voice was composed in the way that doctors are trained to be composed when the news is serious. She looked between me and Robert. The preliminary results came back this morning. The capsules contain a therapeutic compound that is not listed anywhere on the label. Robert leaned forward. What compound? Lorazepam, she said. It's a benzodiazepine, a class of medication used to treat anxiety and sleep disorders. In a clinical setting at appropriate doses, it's a legitimate pharmaceutical. She paused to let that land. In these capsules, it was present at a low but consistent dose, not enough to cause obvious sedation, but enough taken daily over several weeks to produce measurable cognitive effects. Slowed processing, mild confusion, short-term memory gaps. She looked at me directly. Symptoms that, documented by a physician who didn't know the cause, could reasonably be attributed to age-related cognitive decline. The room tilted slightly. Not physically, I was perfectly still, but something in my understanding of the past weeks rearranged itself, and the new picture it formed made my stomach turn cold and hard. She was building a case, I said. The words came out low and stripped bare. That's why she brought them herself. That's why she put them directly in my hand. That would be consistent with the evidence, yes, Dr. Wells said carefully. I want to be clear, I am not making a legal determination. But from a medical standpoint, the presence of this compound in an unlabeled supplement given to an elderly post-surgical patient without a prescription is deeply serious. She straightened. Under Texas law, deliberately administering a controlled substance to an elderly individual without their knowledge or consent constitutes injury to an elderly person. It is a felony. Robert had gone very still beside me, the stillness of a man whose legal mind is processing at full speed, while the rest of him absorbs the shock. Can you document this officially? He asked. Full medical report, your signature, the lab results, chain of custody for the sample. I already started the documentation this morning, Dr. Wells said. I wanted your authorization before I finalized it. She looked at me. Mr. Calloway, this is your call. Once I submit this through official channels, it becomes part of a formal record. That has implications. I looked at that little amber bottle in its sealed bag. I thought about Vanessa sitting in the chair beside my bed, her voice warm and solicitous, her hand steady as she tipped those capsules into my palm. I thought about how I had thanked her, how I had swallowed them with water while she watched. My jaw tightened until I could feel it in my temples. The fury that moved through me was the cold kind, the kind that doesn't shout, the kind that settles into your bones and becomes something you build with. Document everything, I said. Every detail. I want it airtight. Dr. Wells nodded, once picked up the evidence bag, and said she would have the completed report to Robert by end of day. At the door she paused and turned back, and the professional composure cracked just enough to show something human underneath it. Mr. Calloway, she said quietly, I've been practicing medicine for 22 years. What was done to you was calculated and deliberate. I want you to know I take that very seriously. After she left, I looked at Robert. His face had gone through several things in the last 10 minutes, and had arrived at a kind of focused fury that I recognized because I felt it too. She's been running this on multiple tracks simultaneously, he said. The bank inquiries, the estate documents, the footage, and this. Each one a layer. If any single layer failed, the others would still be in place. She's thorough, I said. The word tasted like ash. She's dangerous, Robert said flatly. Art, we need to accelerate everything. Vincent needs to be brought fully in. The board needs to be prepared. He was already reaching for his phone. And you need to not touch anything else Vanessa brings you. Nothing. Not water, not food, not a pen. Understood? My hands were very still on the blanket. Still and deliberate the way hands get when the person they belong to has made a decision so fundamental it doesn't require conscious effort anymore. Grace had been at the far end of the room through all of it, and she came to stand near the bed now, not hovering. Just present the way she always was when something difficult had just occurred, and she understood that presence mattered more than words. Grace, I said. From this point forward, I don't want you to leave anything in this room unattended. If someone brings something in food supplements, anything, it goes in that cabinet and stays there until I decide otherwise. She met my eyes with an expression that mixed steadiness with something that looked very close to protectiveness. Already done, she said. I moved the bottle to the nursing station 2 days ago, before Dr. Wells asked. I stared at her. You suspected. I noticed your response times were slower than they should have been given your recovery trajectory, she said quietly. I didn't know what it meant, but I wasn't willing to do nothing while I figured it out. Something cracked open in my chest, not grief this time, not anger. Something closer to gratitude, so sharp it hurt. Thank you, I said. The 2 words felt entirely inadequate and entirely necessary at the same time. Grace straightened professional again. Rest, she said. You have a fight ahead of you, and you can't run it on an empty tank. She was right. I closed my eyes and felt the cold clarity of a man who finally understands the full shape of what is coming for him and has decided without drama and without doubt that it will not win. 8 days after I left Houston Methodist, the River Oaks house felt both familiar and foreign at the same time. The same hardwood floors Margaret had picked out in 1987. The same view of the back garden from the kitchen window. The live oak she planted the year Tyler was born, now tall enough to shade the entire south corner. The same photographs on the study wall, job sites and groundbreakings and handshakes with people who had mattered to me across 40 years of building. All of it exactly as I had left it. And yet I moved through it differently now, with a walker instead of my own stride, with Grace nearby, instead of alone with the knowledge of the last 3 weeks sitting in my chest, like something that had permanently changed the weight of the air. I had been home 7 days when Tyler came. He didn't call ahead. He arrived on a Wednesday afternoon on his bicycle, 17 years old, still growing into his shoulders, wearing jeans and a plain gray sweatshirt that had seen better days. Grace let him in, and I heard his voice in the entryway, quiet and controlled in a way that didn't belong to a teenager making a casual visit. He appeared in the doorway of the study and looked at me across the room, and the expression on his face stopped me cold. It was the face of someone carrying something heavy and has been carrying it alone for long enough that the weight has changed them. "Hey, Grandpa?" His voice was steady, but his eyes were red at the corners, the kind of red that comes from nights of not enough sleep. "Tyler." I gestured to the chair across from my desk. "Come sit down." He crossed the room, but instead of taking the upholstered chair, he pulled the straight-backed wooden chair from beside the bookcase and positioned it directly across from me. Sat with his back straight and his feet flat on the floor. His hands rested on his thighs, and in his right hand he was holding a small black USB drive. He set it on the desk between us. I looked at it. Then I looked at him. "I've been collecting things for about 6 months, he said. "Emails from my mom's laptop. She leaves it open in the kitchen sometimes when she's on calls. Text conversations on my dad's phone that he left in the car when he went into stores. Conversations I heard and recorded on my own phone." He kept his gaze steady, though I could see the effort it cost him. I didn't hack anything. I didn't break into anything. Everything I got from things that were just open, in my own house. "Tyler, let me finish," he said. The firmness in his voice surprised me. "Please." I closed my mouth and nodded. "I know what they've been doing," he said. "I've known for a while. Not all of it, not the details, but enough to know it was wrong." His jaw tightened the way mine does when I'm fighting to keep my voice level. I kept thinking my dad would stop, that there'd be a point where he'd look at what he was doing and just stop. His voice cracked on the last word just once, a fissure in the careful composure he'd built. He didn't stop. I looked at my grandson, at the straight back and the steady hands and the red corners of his eyes. I thought about what it must have been like to sit at dinner with those two people night after night, knowing what he knew, carrying what he was carrying, waiting for a courage he didn't know how to find yet. "How long have you been sitting on this?" I asked. "Since April." His voice was quiet. I didn't know what to do with it. I didn't know if it was enough to matter. And I kept... He stopped, swallowed, started again. I kept thinking about what it would do to my dad if I did something. His eyes were glassy now, shining with unshed tears he was refusing to let fall, and the sight of it pressed against my chest like a hand pushing down. "He's still my dad." "I know," I said. My voice came out low and rough. "But he was going to hurt you," Tyler said. "He was going to take everything, and you were going to be alone, and I just..." The tears broke through now, one at a time, sliding down his face while he held the rest of himself completely rigid, refusing to make a sound. "I couldn't just do nothing, Grandpa. I couldn't." I stood up from my chair. It hurt, my back screamed at me, my legs protested the sudden demand. But I stood up, steadied myself against the desk, and crossed the 3 feet between us. I put my hand on the back of his neck, the way I used to when he was small, and I felt him shudder once, a single full-body tremor that he immediately controlled. "You did the right thing," I said. "Do you hear me? You did the right thing." He pressed his lips together hard, nodded once. His shoulders dropped slightly, releasing something he'd been holding for a very long time. I sat on the edge of the desk and looked down at that little black USB drive. 6 months of a 17-year-old boy's careful, frightened, courageous work, sitting in a piece of plastic smaller than my thumb. "Tyler," I said, "does anyone know you came here today?" He shook his head. "I told them I was at baseball practice." "Good." I picked up the drive. "I want you to go to baseball practice from now on. Genuinely. Don't change anything about how you behave at home. Don't give them any reason to think you've done something." I held his gaze. "Can you do that?" "Yes, sir." The formality of it, the sir told me everything about how seriously he was taking this. "Robert Hale is going to look at everything on this drive," I said. "And when this is over, I'm going to make sure you understand what you did here today." I set my hand briefly on his shoulder. "Your grandmother would have been proud of you." His composure broke all the way, then, not loudly, not dramatically, just his face crumpling for one honest moment before he pulled it back together with the particular effort of a young man learning what it costs to do hard things. He stood, straightened his sweatshirt, and nodded once more. "Take care of yourself, Grandpa," he said. After he left, I sat for a long time with the USB drive in my palm, and Grace appeared in the doorway with 2 cups of coffee. She set one beside me without asking, looked at my face and said nothing, but her eyes asked the question. "Call Robert," I said. "Tell him he needs to come tonight." She reached for her phone, then she paused. "The folder name Tyler marked," she said quietly, reading something on the small paper label stuck to the USB casing. "James Carver." She looked at me. "Do you know that name?" My blood went cold. Because I did know that name. And whatever James Carver's name was doing on a USB drive, assembled by my 17-year-old grandson, meant that the game I thought I understood had just gotten considerably larger. Robert arrived at 9 that evening with Vincent Hale behind him, and one look at both their faces told me that whatever they had found on Tyler's USB drive, it was worse than what we already knew. I had the study cleared, just the three of us. The door closed a pot of coffee Grace had made before she stepped out to give us the room. Vincent set his laptop on the desk and opened it without preamble the way a man does when he has been sitting on information that is burning a hole through him. "We worked through most of last night," Robert said, taking the chair across from me. Vincent cross-referenced everything Tyler collected against the internal financial data he already had. "What we found—" He stopped, pressed his mouth together, and looked at Vincent. "You walk him through it. You found it." Vincent turned the laptop so I could see the screen. On it was a financial flow diagram, boxes connected by arrows, company names in each box, dollar amounts along the lines between them. "Start with Derek," I said. Vincent nodded. Over the past 2 years, Derek forwarded proprietary bidding information on 7 major Callaway Corporation contracts to an outside party. We're talking about sealed bid numbers, cost projections, subcontractor pricing, the kind of information that if a competitor has it before the bid closes, makes your submission worthless. His jaw was tight. The recipient in each case was a shell company registered in Delaware called Meridian Consulting Group. No website, no employees on record, a registered agent address. That's a mail forwarding service. He pointed to one of the boxes on the diagram. Meridian Consulting Group traces back through 2 additional layers of shell companies to a holding entity controlled by James Carver. I looked at the screen. The arrows connected in a chain that was elegant in its construction and ugly in its intent. "I know James Carver," I said. My voice came out harder than I intended. 5 years ago, he approached me about acquiring our infrastructure division. I turned him down. He shook my hand, smiled, told me he respected the decision. I felt my back teeth press together. He was already planning this. "Almost certainly," Vincent said. "Because here's what Derek doesn't understand." He moved to the next slide, a stock valuation chart with a downward trend line. Every contract Callaway Corporation lost because our bid was undercut, every project that went to a competitor, every quarter of underperformance, it all feeds into one outcome. Our market valuation drops. Our institutional reputation weakens. And when the company is damaged enough, Carver comes in with the buyout offer, I said. "At a fraction of real value," Robert said, his voice flat with controlled anger. "And Derek, who thinks he's been running a clever side arrangement and getting paid for information, ends up with nothing. Because he has no voting shares, no board standing, and whatever cash Carver paid him for the information will be a rounding error compared to what the company is actually worth." The cold in my chest spread outward until I could feel it in my fingertips. Not just anger at Derek, though, that was there burning steady and low. Something closer to a sorrow so deep it had no edges. My son had been selling the company I built with 40 years of my life to a man who was using him as a disposable instrument, and Derek had been too blinded by short-term greed and too hollowed out by years of easy money to see it. "He thought he was being clever," I said. "He thought he was the one running the game," Vincent said quietly. "He had no idea he was the game." Robert leaned forward. "There's more, Art. The text messages Tyler recorded from Derek's phone. There's a meeting scheduled. Derek and a representative of Meridian Consulting Group next Tuesday at the Marriott Marquise downtown. If that meeting happens, the bid package for the Galveston Port expansion project gets handed over." He held my gaze. "That contract is worth $68 million, and it's the largest infrastructure bid we've submitted in a decade." My hands came down flat on the desk, hard. "Can we stop the meeting?" I asked. "We can do something better than stop it," Robert said. If we move the board meeting before Tuesday, we remove Derek's remaining access to company systems entirely. He'll have nothing to hand over because he'll have no access left to steal from. Robert's eyes were sharp and focused, the eyes of a man who had spent 3 decades in courtrooms and knew exactly how to time a move. Vincent, when can the board be assembled? I've already made preliminary calls, Vincent said. Sunday at the latest, possibly Saturday evening. Do it Saturday, I said. I want it done before the weekend is over. Vincent nodded, reaching for his phone. I looked at the flow diagram still on the screen, Callaway Corporation at the center. Those arrows bleeding outward, toward boxes, with names designed to obscure and deceive. I thought about the men who had helped me build that company. The engineers who had stayed late on impossible deadlines. The crews who had worked through Houston summers that would have broken weaker men. 40 years of trust and labor and real work. And my son had been quietly selling it piece by piece to a man who saw it as nothing more than a number on an acquisition spreadsheet. Robert, I said. James Carver sent me a text message after Derek's removal. He said men with nothing left to lose are dangerous. Robert's eyes sharpened immediately. He made contact directly. One message, one line. I picked up my phone and turned it to show him the screen. Robert read it, and something moved through his expression that I rarely saw from him, not quite alarm, but its close neighbor. He's watching. He knows about the removal, and he's trying to gauge your reaction. He set the phone down carefully. Art, once the board acts and Derek loses all access, Carver's acquisition strategy collapses. He may become unpredictable. Let him, I said. My voice came out steady and final. I've been dealing with unpredictable men since before James Carver knew what a balance sheet was. Robert looked at me for a long moment. Then the corner of his mouth shifted, barely a movement more, like the memory of a smile. Saturday morning, he said. We end this. After they left, Grace came back in to clear the coffee cups, and she looked at my face with those perceptive eyes of hers. You're ready, she said. Not a question. Past ready, I told her. And for the first time in weeks, saying it out loud felt like the truth. I had sat at the head of that boardroom table for 28 years. The day I rolled into that room in a wheelchair, I could feel the shift in the air, the moment I crossed the threshold, the particular tension of a space where people have already chosen sides and are waiting to see which side has the stronger hand. 11 board members seated along the oval table of dark walnut that Margaret had helped me pick out in 1996. Men and women I had hired, mentored, argued with, trusted. And at the far end, Derek sat in a charcoal suit with a lawyer I didn't recognize at his elbow. He looked at me when I rolled in. His face did something complicated, a flash of something I might have called guilt if I believed he still had enough of that left to produce it. Then it smoothed back into the careful blankness he'd been wearing since October. Good morning, I said to the room. My voice carried. It always had. Let's get started. Vincent Hale called the meeting to order as acting chair. He had barely finished the procedural opening when Derek's lawyer, a man named Patterson, who had the pressed confidence of someone billing $800 an hour, stood up and set a bound document in the center of the table. Before the agenda proceeds, Patterson said, my client wishes to introduce a controlling document that supersedes the current meeting's purpose. I watched him push the document toward the center of the table. Board members reached for copies that Patterson's assistant distributed with practiced efficiency. I kept my hands on the armrests of my wheelchair and watched Derek's face. This is a comprehensive executive authority document signed by Arthur Callaway. Patterson continued, granting Derek Callaway full operational control of Callaway Corporation in the event of the founder's incapacitation, effective from the date of his hospitalization on October 14th of this year. The room shifted. Could feel it, the collective intake of attention, the rustling of paper as people turned pages, the particular silence of 11 people absorbing something unexpected. Derek leaned back slightly in his chair with the expression of a man who has just played a card he's been holding for a long time. I let him have the moment. Every second of it. Then I looked at Robert, who was standing at the side of the room with his briefcase open on the side table, and I gave him the smallest nod. Robert picked up the remote for the room's presentation screen and pressed a button. "Ladies and gentlemen of the board," he said, his voice carrying the measured authority of a man who has spent 30 years in courtrooms. "Before anyone acts on that document, I'd like to direct your attention to the screen." The first image appeared a metadata report from a digital forensics firm Robert had engaged the week prior. Line by line, it showed the document's creation data file, origin date modification, timestamps, the software version used to generate it. "The document Mr. Patterson just introduced was created on October 3rd of this year," Robert said, 11 days before Mr. Calloway's surgery, at a time when he was actively running the company, attending meetings, and had given no indication to anyone, including his own medical team, that surgery was imminent. He advanced to the next slide. For reference, the surgery was scheduled as an emergency procedure on October 12th, 2 days before it occurred, following an acute deterioration in Mr. Calloway's condition that surprised everyone, including Dr. Wells. Patterson was on his feet. "The creation date of a digital file doesn't establish—" "I'm not finished," Robert said calmly. He advanced again. The screen now showed an email chain, Vanessa's personal address, a series of messages, with an outside document, preparation service, timestamps going back to late September. This correspondence, obtained through a third-party discovery process, shows that the preparation of this document was initiated 5 weeks before the surgery that supposedly prompted it, by a person who is not Arthur Calloway. He paused. "And who is not an attorney of record for this company." Derek's jaw had tightened. His hands were flat on the table. "Furthermore," Robert continued, his voice never rising above a courtroom professional's steady cadence, "we engaged a forensic document examiner last week. Her report, which I'm distributing now," he nodded to Vincent, who began passing folders around the table, "identifies 17 specific characteristics of Mr. Calloway's signature on that document that are inconsistent with his authenticated signature samples from the past decade. Her conclusion, stated with a high degree of professional certainty, is that the signature on that document was not produced by Arthur Calloway." The room went very still. Patterson leaned down and said something in Derek's ear, his voice too low to hear. Derek's face had gone the color of old concrete, flat gray, drained. His shoulders, which had been pulled back with manufactured confidence when I entered, curved inward now, like a structure losing its load-bearing support. "The document is a forgery," Robert said, without drama, without heat. Just a fact stated plainly. Creating a fraudulent legal instrument of this nature in Texas constitutes a third-degree felony under the Penal Code. I have already been in contact with the Harris County District Attorney's Office. He looked around the table. The board may now proceed with the meeting's original agenda. Patterson was gathering his papers. His client's legal strategy had just collapsed in front of 11 witnesses, and the fastest thing a good attorney does in that situation is reduce his own exposure. He leaned down once more to Derek, and this time I caught 2 words: "I'm withdrawing." Derek looked up at his lawyer with an expression I had never seen on my son's face before. Pure, unguarded panic, stripped of every layer of performance he'd ever built over it. For just 1 second, he looked like the 12-year-old boy who had come home from school one afternoon, having broken something he couldn't fix and didn't know how to tell me. Then he looked at me. Across the length of that walnut table, across 28 years of that room and everything it represented, I held his gaze. My chest ached with something that wasn't anger, and wasn't satisfaction, and wasn't grief, but contained pieces of all 3. I held his gaze and I didn't look away, because I had stopped looking away from things a long time ago, and I wasn't going to start now. Patterson walked out. The door closed behind him with a sound that echoed longer than it should have. Vincent called for the vote on Derek's removal. I looked down at my hands in my lap while the ballots were cast, not because I couldn't watch, but because some things don't require witnessing. Some things you already know the outcome of before the count is finished. 11 votes, 11. When the result was announced, Derek stood. He didn't speak. He buttoned his jacket with hands that were trembling visibly, and he walked out of that boardroom without looking at a single person in it. I listened to his footsteps cross the marble floor outside. I listened until I couldn't hear them anymore. Before I reveal what happened the afternoon, I called my son back to the house he grew up in. Comment the word truth below. Because what was said in that living room is something I have never spoken out loud to anyone. Until now. A note. Before we continue, this story contains some fictional elements added for depth and clarity. The names and details may not all be drawn from a single source, but everything this story is trying to tell you is worth hearing. 5 days after the board meeting ended Derek's last foothold in Callaway Construction, I called him and told him to come home. Not to my lawyer's office. Not to a conference room with glass walls and recorded minutes. Home, the house on River Oaks Boulevard, where he had learned to ride a bicycle on the front driveway, and where his mother had died in the upstairs bedroom, with both of us holding her hands. Grace had helped me dress that morning without me asking. She laid out my navy shirt and the silver cufflinks Margaret gave me on our 35th anniversary, and when she handed them to me, she said, "You look like a man who built something." I didn't answer, but I held those cufflinks in my palm for a long moment before I put them on. Robert arrived at 1:45. He set his briefcase on the dining table and opened it without ceremony, spreading printed documents across the mahogany surface in a precise, deliberate row. "Art," he said, not looking up. "When Derek walks in, let me lead with the documents first. Give him no room to construct a narrative before the evidence is on the table." "Agreed," I said. At exactly 2 o'clock, the front doorbell rang. Grace opened it. Derek walked in first, shoulders squared, wearing the charcoal blazer he always wore when he wanted to appear in command of something. Vanessa came in behind him, leather portfolio tucked under her arm, chin lifted at an angle that had always reminded me of a person preparing to testify. "Dad." Derek's voice was careful, controlled, the voice of a man who had rehearsed. "Come and sit down." I gestured toward the chairs across the fireplace. Vanessa set her portfolio on the coffee table with a sharp click and crossed her legs. "Arthur, before anything begins, I want to be clear. Derek's attorney has advised us that any discussion of pending legal matters—" "Vanessa." Robert's voice was flat and final. "Derek's attorney is not in this room. I am. And I have been Arthur's legal counsel for 21 years, which means everything on this table has already been reviewed by people whose job it is to determine what is admissible and what is actionable. So please sit down." Vanessa's jaw tightened so hard I could see the muscle flex beneath her cheekbone. She sat. Derek looked at the documents spread across the table, and something moved through his face fast, involuntary, the flicker of a man who recognizes what he is looking at. "The Meridian Consulting Group," Robert said, sliding the first document forward. "A Delaware shell company incorporated 14 months ago. Its sole operational function has been receiving forwarded bid intelligence from a Callaway Construction internal email account registered to Derek Callaway, Senior Vice President of Development, and relaying that intelligence to the acquisitions team of Carver Capital Holdings." Derek's throat moved. "I can explain. The Galveston Port expansion contract." Robert continued, sliding a second document. $68 million. Callaway submitted the lowest qualifying bid. We lost the contract by a margin of $400,000 to a firm that had never previously competed in the Gulf Coast infrastructure market. That firm was backed by Carver Capital. Robert placed his finger on the page. "The bid figures your team submitted internally were forwarded from your email address 46 hours before the submission deadline." "That's circumstantial," Derek started. "The encryption key on the forwarded files carries your personal digital signature, Derek." Robert's voice did not rise. It never needed to. That is not circumstantial. That is forensic. Derek shot to his feet. His chair scraped back hard against the hardwood floor, and the sound cracked through the room like a gunshot. His hands were balled at his sides, knuckles white, and his eyes were burning with something that looked like anger, but moved like panic underneath. "You want to talk about forensics?" His voice cracked on the last word. "Let's talk about what this company looked like when you were in that hospital. Dad, the quarterly numbers were collapsing. 3 contractors were threatening to walk, and Vincent Hale was running around telling the board you might not recover full capacity. Vincent Hale's concerns about my capacity were based on a physician's affidavit," I said, and my voice came out lower and quieter than I expected, which somehow made it cut deeper. "That was fabricated on a device registered to your home network on the afternoon of October 3rd, the same afternoon I was admitted for pre-surgical preparation." The color left Derek's face in a single visible wave. He stood there with his jaw working and nothing coming out, and for one moment, he looked exactly like the boy he used to be, caught exposed, stripped of every defense he had constructed. Vanessa made a sharp sound and turned her face away toward the window. "I didn't—" Derek's voice broke apart. He pressed the back of his hand against his mouth. His eyes were reddening at the edges, filling fast with something wet and furious and devastated all at once. "I didn't know she was going to use a fraudulent document. I told her what I needed and I didn't ask." "You didn't ask." The words came out of me slowly, each one weighted. My chest ached with a grief I had been carrying for 6 weeks. The specific, exhausting grief of loving someone who is actively destroying what you built for them. "That is your answer, Derek. You needed something done and you simply declined to examine how it was being done." "I was drowning." The words exploded out of him, raw, cracked open, nothing rehearsed left in them. Tears broke over his lower lids and ran down his jaw, and he didn't wipe them, didn't try to, just stood there shaking with his hands balled at his sides and his voice fracturing further with every word. "I had $3.4 million in debt. Private loans, gambling losses, investment failures I couldn't fix. I woke up every morning and the number was the same, and I couldn't see any way out that didn't end with everyone knowing I had failed completely." The fire in the hearth crackled. Outside, through the tall windows, the November light fell pale and cold across the live oaks Margaret had planted 3 decades ago. "You could have come to me," I said, and my own voice was not steady anymore. My eyes burned. My hands gripped the armrests of my chair so hard, the leather groaned. "You could have walked through that door and sat in that chair and told me the truth. I would have been furious. I would have argued with you. But I would have helped you, Derek, because you are my son, and that does not stop being true no matter what you do with it." Derek's chin shook. His whole face shook. He pressed both palms flat over his eyes, and a sound came out of him, not a word, not a cry exactly, something deeper and more broken than either the sound of a man arriving finally, and too late at the full weight of what he had done. Grace stepped quietly from the hallway doorway, set a glass of water on the table beside me, and rested her hand briefly on my shoulder. The warmth of that small gesture was the only thing keeping my voice from breaking entirely. "An apology," I said at last, "is only the first door in a very long hallway, Derek. What you do after you walk through it, that is what matters now." Robert had stepped into the study to take a call from the Harris County DA's office. Vanessa had walked out onto the back porch. I could see her silhouette through the glass door, phone pressed hard to her ear. One hand pressed flat against the porch railing, like she needed something solid to hold on to. That left Derek and me alone in the living room for the first time in what felt like years. He was still sitting on the couch. He had not moved since his legs had finally given out beneath him 20 minutes earlier. His elbows were on his knees, his face bent toward the floor, and he was breathing with the careful deliberateness of a man trying to hold himself together by controlling the one thing he still could. "Derek!" My voice came out even. "Look at me." He lifted his head. His eyes were swollen, nearly shut red from the inside out, the tear tracks still visible on his jaw. He looked 44 years old, and somehow simultaneously about 12. I hated that I could still see both ages in his face at the same time. 3.4 million, I said. That's the total. He nodded once, give or take. And Meridian paid you 800,000 over 14 months. Yes. The word came out scraped and flat. So you sold your father's company's intelligence for less than a quarter of what you owed. I kept my voice level. And you still had no way out. Derek's hands tightened on his knees until his knuckles went white as bone. The plan was to use the Carver money to cover the most urgent loans and buy enough time to restructure. But the debts kept compounding. The interest on the private loans was 18%. Every month I covered one hole, two more opened. Why didn't you come to me? My voice cracked on the last word, just slightly, just enough. I pressed my fist to the center of my chest where the ache had been living since October. Derek, why didn't you come to me? His face crumpled completely. Not gradually all at once, like a structure that had been bearing more weight than it was built to hold, and finally catastrophically gives way. His chin dropped to his chest. His shoulders heaved. A sound broke out of him from somewhere deep behind his sternum, a raw, wretched shaking sound, and he wept the way a man weeps when he has run completely out of performance, and there is nothing left but the truth of what he feels. Because I was ashamed. The words came out between ragged breaths barely formed. Because you built all of this from nothing, and I couldn't even keep myself solvent. I couldn't tell you I had gambled away money, that I had taken private loans from people who were not the kind of people you borrow from. I couldn't sit across from you and say, Dad, I failed. I couldn't do it. My throat closed so tight I had to breathe carefully through my nose for several seconds. My eyes burned. I did not blink. Tyler came to see me every week, I said at last. My voice was quiet now, not soft, but the specific quietness of something very serious. Every single week, while you were filing guardianship papers and redirecting company funds, that boy, your 17-year-old son, was sitting in my hospital room, asking if I needed anything from the pharmacy, telling me about his school projects, holding my hand when the pain medication made me disoriented at 3 a.m. My voice broke open on the last sentence, and I let it. He understood what a son owes a father. Think very carefully about what that means, Derek. Derek made a sound like he had been struck. His head snapped up, and the look on his face, the raw, unguarded devastation of hearing your own child used as a mirror for your failure, was the most painful thing I had seen in 73 years of living. His whole body was shaking. His hands were trembling against his thighs. His jaw worked without producing words. I know, he finally managed. I know what I am. I know what I did. He pressed the heels of both hands against his eyes so hard, the skin around them went white. I don't know how to fix this, Dad. Tell me how to fix this. You cannot fix it, I said plainly. You can only move forward differently. He dropped his hands. His eyes met mine, swollen raw, stripped of every layer of pretense, and he asked in a voice barely above a whisper, Are you going to let the DA prosecute? Robert cannot stop the process, and I will not ask him to. I held his gaze. The fraudulent affidavit and the Meridian data sales are matters of Texas law, not matters of my personal choice. You will need your own attorney and not one connected to Vanessa's arrangements. I paused. But I am asking Robert to structure a repayment arrangement against your Callaway shares that will allow you to address the private debt without personal bankruptcy. That is not forgiveness, Derek. That is me making certain my grandson does not spend his senior year watching his father be destroyed beyond recovery. Derek stared at me. His lips trembled. Fresh tears spilled down his already wet cheeks, and he didn't seem to notice, or perhaps he had simply stopped caring whether I saw them. Why? His voice was broken and genuine and desperate. After everything, why would you do that? I leaned forward slowly, joints aching with the effort, and I placed my hand over both of his. His fingers were cold and shaking beneath my palm. His hands, these hands that I had once held when he was 3 days old and had not yet learned to be afraid of anything, were trembling like a man standing on the edge of something he could not come back from. Because you are my son, I said. That is the most painful part of all of this. It never stops being true. Derek bent forward, forehead nearly touching our joined hands, and he wept with his whole body. Deep shaking, ugly, honest crying that had no performance in it and no end in sight. I kept my hand over his, and I did not pull away. I had not forgiven him. Not yet. But I had made the decision to remain, to not let the wreckage become the final word. At 73 years old, I have learned that remaining, choosing not to walk away even when you have every right to, is sometimes the most difficult act of love there is, and the most necessary one. Robert appeared at the study doorway. He looked at us, read the room with quiet precision, and gave a single nod, the nod of a man who has spent 21 years knowing when to stay back and when to step forward. Outside, the November sun was beginning to drop behind the live oaks. The light turned the color of old copper across the floor. I had more to say to my son. But not today. Today I simply held on. 2 days after Derek wept in my living room, I woke up at 5 in the morning and could not go back to sleep. I lay in the dark and stared at the ceiling and thought about Margaret. About the way she used to say that grief and purpose were not opposites, that the most powerful thing a person could do after being broken was decide with full clarity what they were going to build next. I got dressed, called Grace, and told her I needed to go to Robert's office. Grace drove me downtown in the pale gray light of a November morning, Houston's skyline rising ahead of us through the windshield like a row of declarations. She didn't ask me questions. She just drove with both hands on the wheel and occasionally glanced at me in the way she had developed over 6 weeks of caring for me, a glance that said, "I see you," without requiring a response. Robert was already at his desk when we arrived at 9. He had a legal pad in front of him and 2 cups of coffee waiting, which told me he had expected me earlier than I actually came. "You look like you made a decision," he said, pushing a cup toward me. "Several." I sat down across from him and set my hands flat on the desk. "I want to revise the will completely, Robert, not adjust. Rebuild it from the foundation." Robert uncapped his pen. "Tell me what you want." "The company," I said. 100% of Class A voting shares remain in my name until I die. At the time of my death, 60% transfers into a management trust administered by a board of 5, Vincent Hale, 2 independent directors, and 2 seats elected annually by senior staff. Derek receives no voting shares. He receives a fixed annual distribution from Class B dividends, only contingent on his completing a financial accountability program and maintaining clean legal standing for 3 consecutive years. Robert was writing fast. "And the remaining 40%, Callaway Legacy Foundation." I leaned forward slightly. "A charitable trust. Its purpose funding recovery housing, legal aid, and transitional support for elderly individuals who have been financially exploited by family members. I want it operational within 18 months of my death. I want Grace Bennett named as founding director." Robert stopped writing. He looked up at me over the rim of his glasses. "Art that is a significant structural commitment. I know exactly what it is." My voice was steady. My chest was steady. For the first time in 6 weeks, everything inside me felt like it was pointing in the same direction. Margaret spent her last 2 years volunteering at a senior center in Montrose. She used to come home and tell me about people exactly like me, Robert, who had been stripped of everything by the people who were supposed to love them. I always listened, and I never did anything about it. My throat tightened briefly. I am done not doing anything about it. Robert set down his pen. He pressed his lips together, and I could see something moving behind his eyes. Not sentiment exactly, but the specific expression of a man who has known another man for 21 years and is watching him become in a single morning more fully himself than he has been in decades. "Grace," Robert said, turning toward the doorway, where she had been standing with her coffee cup. "You heard all of that." Grace straightened. Her eyes were bright, not with tears exactly, but with the particular brightness that comes just before tears decide whether to fall or recede. "I heard it. Are you willing to take on that role?" Grace set her cup down carefully on the side table. She crossed the room, pulled out the chair beside mine, and sat down. When she spoke, her voice was composed, but her hands folded in her lap were gripping each other tightly enough that her knuckles had gone pale. "Mr. Calloway," she said, "I became a nurse because I believed that caring for someone, really caring, not just medically, but as a human being, was one of the most important things a person could do." Her voice dropped slightly. "But I have sat with patients whose families never came. I have held hands at 3 in the morning for people whose children stopped returning calls. I have watched people give up not because they were sick, but because they were alone." Her jaw tightened. "If you are offering me the chance to do something about that, then yes. Without hesitation, yes." I felt my eyes sting sharply. I blinked twice fast and hard and looked down at the desk for a moment to collect myself. "Good," I said when I trusted my voice again. "Then that is settled." Robert picked up his pen again and kept writing. For the next 3 hours, we worked through every detail: the trust structure, the foundation's operating charter, the repayment arrangement for Derek's private debts against his Class B shares, the legal firewall separating the foundation's assets from any future litigation. Robert drafted language. I revised it. Grace asked questions that neither Robert nor I had thought to ask: practical questions about how the foundation would actually receive and process people, what criteria would determine eligibility, how staff would be hired and trained. By noon, Robert had 40 pages of preliminary notes and the outline of a document that would take his team 3 weeks to finalize. "Arthur," Robert said, as Grace went to get more coffee, "I want to flag one thing." "Go ahead." "Vanessa." He tapped his pen against the legal pad. "She has not retained separate counsel yet, which means she is still technically covered under Derek's representation. But the fraudulent affidavit, the metadata links her more directly than Derek. The DA's office is going to want to talk to her, and when they do, her instinct is going to be to protect herself first." He looked at me carefully. "That may create a situation between her and Derek that neither of them is prepared for." I considered that. My chest tightened, not with grief this time, but with the particular heaviness of knowing that more pain was coming and not being able to prevent it. "I cannot manage Vanessa," I said. "I can only manage what I build." "I know," Robert said. "I just want you prepared." Grace came back with the coffee. She set a cup in front of me and looked at my face with the precision of a woman who reads people for a living. "You're worried about Derek," she said. "Not a question." "I'm worried about Tyler," I said honestly. "Whatever happens between Derek and Vanessa, that boy is 17 years old, and he is going to be standing in the middle of it." Grace's expression softened with something that ached. "Then we make sure Tyler knows he has somewhere to stand that isn't the middle." I looked at her, this woman who had shown up every single day when my own blood had not, and I thought about Margaret's voice saying, "Grief and purpose are not opposites." I thought about 40 pages of notes on a legal pad. I thought about a foundation that did not yet exist, but would. Yes, I said. We do. Robert had warned me. I replayed his words the morning Grace drove me to Derek's house. Vanessa's instinct is going to be to protect herself first. I had told him I could not manage Vanessa. What I had not told him was that I fully intended to try. The call had come from Derek at 7 that morning. His voice on the phone was thin and strained, the voice of a man who had not slept and was running on something grimmer than coffee. Dad, I need you to come. Vanessa, something happened last night. I can't explain it on the phone. Please. Grace pulled up to the house on Plum Street at 11 o'clock sharp. Derek opened the front door before we reached the porch steps. He was wearing yesterday's clothes. His hair was uncombed. His eyes were red-rimmed and dry, the specific look of a man who has cried everything out and is now operating in the hollow space on the other side of it. She's in the kitchen, he said. Vanessa was sitting at the kitchen island, with both hands wrapped around a mug of coffee she was not drinking. She was dressed precisely, pressed blouse hair, arranged, makeup applied, which told me everything I needed to know about how she was actually feeling. Vanessa Calloway only got perfectly dressed when she was preparing for a battle she wasn't sure she could win. Arthur. She looked up at me, and something in her eyes was different from the woman who had sat across from me in my living room 3 weeks earlier. The chin was still lifted, but the certainty behind it was gone. Vanessa. I pulled out the stool across from her and sat down. Grace stood near the doorway. Derek stood beside the refrigerator with his arms crossed and his jaw working. Tell him, Derek said. His voice came out flat and cracked at the same time. Vanessa's fingers tightened around the mug. The DA's office called me yesterday afternoon, separately, not through Derek's attorney. She paused. They told me the fraudulent affidavit carries my IP address, my device signature, and a timestamp showing it was created while Derek was in a client meeting across town. She looked at me with eyes that were very steady and very tired, meaning I created it without his knowledge. The kitchen went very still. Derek made a sound low, guttural, the sound of a man absorbing a blow he somehow both expected and could not prepare for. He pressed the back of his hand hard against his mouth. Derek didn't know, Vanessa said. Her voice was controlled, but the mug in her hands was trembling, fine, small tremors she could not fully suppress. He told me he needed the guardianship filing to go through. He told me what outcome he needed. He didn't ask how. I handled it. That was always how we operated. You forged a physician's statement, I said. Not as an accusation, simply as a fact that needed to exist in the open air between us. You falsified a medical document to have a 73-year-old man declared cognitively incapacitated so your husband could seize control of his estate. Vanessa flinched, a small, sharp movement she could not contain. Her jaw tightened. I did it because we were about to lose everything. The debts, the loans, I had been managing the pressure of that for 2 years without telling Derek half of how bad it actually was, because every time I tried to explain it, he shut down. I needed it resolved. I needed it resolved before it destroyed us. Her voice cracked on the last word just slightly. I did not stop to think carefully enough about what I was doing to you. No, I said. You did not. Derek pushed off from the refrigerator. His hands were shaking. His eyes were wet and furious and broken all at once. 2 years, Vanessa. You were managing this for 2 years without telling me the full picture, and then you committed a felony in my name. I committed it to protect us. You committed it to protect yourself. Derek's voice broke open completely. He was crying now, hard, ugly, angry tears, the kind that come from a place too deep for composure to reach. You made me complicit in something I didn't even fully understand. And now the DA has both our names, and Tyler is 17 years old, and... His voice collapsed entirely. He pressed both hands flat over his face and stood there with his shoulders shaking, and his chest heaving, and the sound he made was the sound of a man who has just understood all at once the complete shape of what has been done to his life. Grace stepped forward from the doorway, not toward Vanessa, not toward Derek, but toward me. She put her hand on my shoulder and kept it there. Vanessa set the mug down. Her hands were trembling visibly now, no longer suppressed. She looked at Derek, really looked at him past the fury and the broken posture, at the man underneath, and something moved across her face that might have been grief, or might have been the beginning of it. "I'm going to cooperate with the DA," she said. Her voice was quieter now, smaller. "Full cooperation in exchange for consideration on sentencing. My attorney is filing the agreement today." She exhaled slowly. "And I think Derek and I need to be separated while the legal process runs. For Tyler's sake. For everyone's sake." Derek lifted his face from his hands. His eyes met hers, and the look between them was not anger anymore. It was the exhausted, devastated recognition of two people who have hurt each other past the point where ordinary repair is possible. "Tyler stays with me," Derek said. "At least until this is resolved." "Agreed," Vanessa said. I looked at them both, my son and the woman he had built a life with, sitting in a kitchen, in a house that suddenly felt very large and very cold, and I felt a grief that had nothing triumphant in it. I had not come here to win something. I had come because my son called me at 7 in the morning and needed his father. "Tyler," I said. "Someone needs to tell Tyler." Derek wiped his face with the back of his hand. "I'll tell him tonight." "Tell him he can call me," I said. "Anytime, day or night." Derek looked at me across the kitchen. This man who was my son, who had broken things, I had spent a lifetime building, who was now standing in the rubble of his own making. And he nodded. Once. With the full weight of someone who finally understood what it cost to be loved without condition. Grace squeezed my shoulder gently. Outside through the kitchen window, the December light was thin and pale over the neighborhood. I had more things to build. But first I needed to make sure the people I loved knew where to find me. 12 days after Vanessa walked out of the house on Plum Street with 2 suitcases and a cooperation agreement signed with the Harris County DA's office, a white envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address. My name written in Derek's handwriting, the same slanted, slightly rushed script I had watched him practice on homework assignments 40 years ago. I stood at the mailbox for longer than I should have, holding it in both hands, in the cold December air. The morning was gray and still. My breath came out in faint clouds. I turned the envelope over once, twice, as if the back of it might tell me something the front could not. It told me nothing. It just waited the way letters from people who have run out of excuses tend to do. Grace was making coffee in the kitchen when I brought it inside. She saw the envelope in my hand, and she saw my face, and she said, "Do you want me to give you some space?" "No," I said. "Stay." She turned the coffee down to low and came to the table without another word. That was Grace. She never needed to be asked twice, and she never made a moment bigger than it needed to be. She simply showed up, which was, I had learned over these past months, the rarest and most valuable thing a person could do. I sat down at the kitchen table and opened it. The letter was 3 pages handwritten on legal pad paper, the lines slightly crooked, the way they get when a person is writing fast and cannot stop. "I will not repeat every word here. Some things belong only to the person they were written for. But I will say this: Derek did not make excuses. He did not ask for anything. He simply told the truth sentence by sentence about every decision he had made and why he had made it, and somewhere on the second page his handwriting got uneven. The letters larger, the pen pressed harder into the paper, the way handwriting looks when the hand holding the pen is shaking. My throat closed. My eyes burned so sharply I had to press the back of my hand against them and hold it there. "Dad," Grace said softly from across the table. "Give me a moment," I managed. I pressed my lips together hard and breathed and kept reading. On the second page, Derek wrote about Margaret. He wrote about a Sunday morning when he was 11 years old, and he had broken an expensive lamp in the living room and lied about it, and how Margaret had sat him down that evening, not angrily, but with that particular quiet of hers that was somehow more serious than anger, and told him that the lamp did not matter, that the lie was the only thing that mattered, because a lie was a choice to put distance between yourself and the people who loved you. He wrote, "I forgot that. Mom spent her whole life trying to teach me that, and I forgot it entirely. I am sorry I forgot it. I am sorry she is not here for me to tell her." My hand went flat against the table. My chest contracted so sharply that I had to breathe through it in slow, deliberate pulls the way the physical therapist had taught me after surgery. Grace's hand came across the table and covered mine without a word, and I gripped it tighter than I intended, probably, and kept reading. Near the end of the 3rd page, Derek had written, "I know I cannot undo what I did. I know that. But I want you to know that the man who did those things, the man who stood outside your recovery room window and calculated instead of praying, I am done being him. I don't know yet who I am going to be instead, but I am. I'm going to find out. I owe you that. I owe Tyler that. I owe myself that." I set the letter down on the table. My hands were trembling, fine, uncontrollable tremors that I could not suppress any more than Derek could suppress his handwriting on page 2. My chest felt cracked open and full at the same time, which is the particular sensation of grief releasing its grip on something it has been holding for too long. My eyes were wet. I did not try to conceal it. At 73 years old, I have earned the right to cry at my kitchen table over a letter from my son. "Is it what you hoped for?" Grace asked quietly. I looked at the letter at 3 pages of my son's handwriting, and his truth, and his unsteady hand, and I felt something shift inside my chest. Not forgiveness entirely. Not yet forgiveness. I have come to believe is not a door you walk through once. It is a road you choose to stay on day after day, even when it is difficult, even when the hurt flares back up without warning. What I felt that morning was not the destination. It was the first step onto the road. "It's a start," I said. My voice was rough and low and full of everything I did not have words for. "It's a real start." Grace squeezed my hand. "What are you going to do?" I looked at the letter one more time. At Derek's name at the bottom of the 3rd page, signed not with the confident signature he used on company documents, but with small, careful letters, the signature of a man who was no longer certain of what his name meant and was trying slowly to find out. "I'm going to write him back," I said. Grace's eyes went bright at the corners. She pressed her lips together, and I could see her fighting the same thing I was fighting, that specific aching warmth that comes when something broken begins against all probability to move toward being whole. "Do you know what you'll say?" she asked. I thought about Margaret sitting Derek down over a broken lamp and a quiet lie. I thought about Tyler appearing at my hospital door every single week with his school projects and his steady eyes. I thought about 40 years of a handwriting I would recognize in the dark. "Yes," I said. "I know exactly what I'll say." I reached for the notepad Grace kept on the kitchen counter for grocery lists, uncapped the pen beside it, and I began. The morning of January 11th, I put on the same navy shirt and the silver cufflinks Margaret gave me on our 35th anniversary. The same ones I had worn the day I called Derek home for the confrontation that changed everything. Grace noticed immediately when she picked me up. "You wore those the day of the meeting," she said, eyes bright. "I know," I said. "Some things deserve to come full circle." The Foundation's offices occupied the 3rd floor of a building on Main Street that Robert had helped me lease in December. The lobby was full: social workers, elder care attorneys, 3 city council members, 2 journalists, and a row of elderly men and women seated near the front, whose faces I did not recognize but whose eyes I understood completely. They were the people this place was built for. Robert stood near the entrance with a folder in his hand and something rare on his face, a smile that reached his eyes. "You ready, Art?" 20 years late, I said, but yes. Grace stepped up to the podium first. She was wearing her dark green blazer, the one she always wore when she meant business. And when she looked out at the room, her eyes were shining, and her jaw was set with the kind of quiet determination that I had come to recognize as her truest expression. "I have sat with people in hospital rooms at 3 in the morning," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room, "who were not afraid of dying. They were afraid of being forgotten. They were afraid of the silence that comes when the people who were supposed to show up stopped showing up." Her voice thickened slightly, but she did not pause. This foundation exists so that silence has somewhere to be broken. I felt my eyes sting sharply. I blinked and kept blinking. Then I felt a hand close around my arm from the right side, a young hand, firm and warm. I turned. Tyler was standing beside me, in a collared shirt, his hair combed back, his jaw carrying the first faint suggestion of the man he was becoming. His eyes were red at the edges. He had been crying recently, or close to it, but he was smiling. A real smile, wide and unguarded, the smile of a 17-year-old boy who had decided to show up. "Grandpa," he said, his voice rough with something he was working to contain. "Dad wanted to be here. He said to tell you he's working on it." My chest clenched so hard I had to breathe twice before I could speak. I put my arm around Tyler's shoulders and pulled him close, and he leaned into me the way children do when they are still young enough to let themselves need someone. "Tell your father," I said, my voice barely holding, "that the door is open. It always was." Tyler nodded against my shoulder. Outside the windows, Houston's January sky was pale and clear and full of light. I had lost a great deal. I had nearly lost more. But standing in that room with Grace at the podium and Robert at the door and my grandson's shoulder warm beneath my arm, I understood with the full clarity of a man who has been broken and chosen to build anyway that this was not an ending. This was the blueprint for everything that came next. Looking back at everything that happened from that cold recovery room at Houston Methodist to that January morning standing beside Tyler in front of the doors of the Callaway Legacy Foundation, I can only say one thing: I was lucky. Not because I was wealthy, not because I won, but because God placed the right person in the right place at exactly the right time, and that person was not my own flesh and blood. That is the most painful truth I have ever had to admit. If you are reading this and you still have aging parents, call them today. Do not wait until they are lying in a hospital bed before you realize how many calls you let go unanswered. Do not be like me, a man who nearly lost everything before he understood that love is not an asset to be inherited. It is something that must be chosen again every single day. My belief is simple. Money can build a house, but only presence can build a family. And a family story is never written in a will. It is written in the mornings you choose to stay. This is my grandpa stories, imperfect, unheroic, but completely real. If this grandpa stories touched your heart in any way, please leave a comment below. I read every single one. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. And if you want to stay with more family stories like this one, hit subscribe so you never miss another family story when it arrives. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story that means more than you know. A note to our viewers: the stories on this channel contain some fictional elements crafted purely for educational and inspirational purposes. If this type of content is not the right fit for you right now, that is completely okay. Feel free to step away, find content that serves you better, and come back whenever you are ready. This door is always open.